I'd like to thank the La Jolla Music Society for inviting me to do this presentation, and particularly the artistic administrator, Frank Avril, for taking a gamble with somebody he had never met or heard before. Thank you very much, Frank, for this opportunity, and thank you, Stan, for suggesting the opportunity to Frank. I really appreciate that. It's wonderful to see so many good friends from the Osher Institute, from UCSD, and from Oasis. And I'm glad to have my family here, my wife Patrice, an actor and writer who has taught me more about public speaking and performing than anybody else, my daughter Eva, and my son Mike for the support far away. And I've seen some neighbors in the audience here today too. And I know they'll back me up when I say I've spent no time preparing for this event. Well, like, close that window! I'd like to hear that Beethoven one more time. Anyway, thank you all for coming. This is really a great privilege and pleasure. So the question of the day is this: was Beethoven a classical composer or a romantic composer? Well, it's easy. He was a classical composer, right? Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, classical composers, that's the period. Or, oh, that's easy. He was a classical composer, well, through his middle period. And then suddenly he got so deaf that he began to write really romantic music instead. So Haydn, Mozart, early and middle Beethoven. If you had walked up to Beethoven himself for most of his life and said, "Are you a classical composer or a romantic composer?" he would have said, "What?" And then you might have said, "Are you a classical composer?" Well, he still would have said, "What?" Not because he couldn't hear, but because he wouldn't understand the question at all. And that's for a good and simple reason. The word classical was really hardly ever used with reference to music during most of Beethoven's life. In fact, during all of Beethoven's life. When it was used, it meant sort of really of high stature, great, big, significant musicians. So for example, Bach and Handel. Yeah, they were classical composers. Once in a while you would hear that. Or it referred to a type of music that was highly disciplined. So perhaps again Haydn and Mozart would qualify as classical composers. The sonata, however, brings into one piece of music contrasting feelings. So the early example I'd like to illustrate with is one by a Neapolitan composer who spent much of his life in Spain and Portugal by the name of Domenico Scarlatti. He wrote over 500 of these tiny little keyboard pieces. He called them esercizi, exercises. They were later called sonatas. Not all of them follow this form, but the one that I have picked out to demonstrate with shows it in kind of an embryonic version. So what I'd like to do is demonstrate. I will interrupt myself as I go along to show you what part corresponds to what, but the idea is that there are two rather sharply contrasting musical themes in one piece, and each of them gives a kind of different feeling. So this is a very famous piece. I'm sure you've heard it before. It's an E-flat major sonata by Scarlatti. So first theme, we'll call it the A theme, and we'll call the second theme the B theme, and then when we come to talk about the mature sonata form, we'll come back to those terms. things. After that's over, transitional material. It's not the theme, but it belongs to what later music analysts would call the A theme group. But the important thing is where I just stopped. Two things. One, he's changed key. Two, there's a fermata there, meaning pause. Show the audience very clearly that something new is about to happen, and something very new does start to happen. Second theme, sharply contrasting with the first, again, comes to a pause. You can repeat if you like. I won't, there isn't time. Or you now go on. The next section takes the second of those themes, but it could take both of them, and plays around with it in a rather improvisatory way, but it's free form. The thing to notice is that there is considerable harmonic instability in this part, plus the introduction of a chord that I'm going to be talking about later in connection with Beethoven, the diminished seventh chord, which is always a transitional chord between two different keys. What was major before becomes minor now, what was minor before can become major now. So it's an exploration of the themes. It's kind of a transitional phase before he comes back, in this case, to a repetition of the B theme. So this is what later musicians will call the development section. So let me just very quickly take you through how that works in the exposition section of the sonata. And again, I will interrupt myself to explain what I'm talking about. The opening is marked pianissimo, so you're meant to play this as absolutely softly as possible, and it has all the suspense that I described a minute ago. Beethoven had recently acquired a new piano made by a German-French maker. Think about the pianos that Haydn and Mozart played on. They're kind of like toy pianos by today's standards. This was bigger and sturdier, produced a bigger sound, and above all, it had a range unlike previous pianos, from this low F to this high C. Beethoven used the whole thing. So on a piano of the sort that Mozart had played, you wouldn't be able to do this next thing. You would have reduced it to a pile of rubble on the stage. But here's Beethoven at his furious best. The passage is divided into fortissimo, piano, fortissimo, piano, fortissimo, piano. So, and you're all familiar with it. Fortissimo. Again, fortissimo. Now piano. He is going to lead us into the B theme. So there's a sense of the music kind of slowing down to mark the contrast between the A section and the B section. And now we have that B theme again, that beautiful Dolce theme. But here too, he does something bizarre. It sounds perfectly wonderful. Why doesn't he have us play the whole thing, piano and Dolce? Instead, he has us play the melody one time like that, and then he asks us to crescendo, abruptly get soft, abruptly get loud, and abruptly get soft again. That's where the piano teacher rats your knuckles, because it doesn't make sense. Mark Dolce. Now here, crescendo. Soft. Loud. The exposition section. So I think I counted there about 24 surprising, gratuitous, dynamic shifts over a stretch of about 64 bars. I'd like to spend the rest of the time telling a little narrative that goes through all three movements of the sonata. And I'd like to call this the epic struggle between the dastardly diminished seventh chord and the doughty dominant seventh chord. And I'll explain what I mean by those terms. Even if you've never heard of a diminished seventh chord or a dominant seventh chord, you know what I'm talking about. Here's a diminished seventh chord. It sounds like this. It is intrinsically suspenseful and unstable. Why is it suspenseful? Because it is. Think the soundtrack to a movie. If the hero is walking down the street, nothing in particular is happening, the orchestra strikes up this chord, something bad is going to happen. There's another reason that it's unstable. It has 4 notes in it. They are equally spaced apart. This chord can never just live by itself. It's not there to last. It's there to get out and move to something else. But because there are 4 notes that are equally spaced apart, it can go 4 different places, and you don't know to which. It can go, or it can go, or it can go, or it can go. Same note. So it's an intrinsically suspenseful, unstable chord. And in 1 second, I'll tell you what Beethoven does with it. Here's a dominant 7th chord. It's the chord that leads to the home key, the tonic chord, the 1 chord, the key in which the piece is played. It's there for that purpose and almost exclusively for that purpose. So in a sense, it's not really stable either. You don't end the piece on this sound. But it's also not a suspenseful sound. If the hero in the movie is walking down the street and the orchestra strikes up this chord, you don't think something bad is going to happen. You maybe think something triumphant will happen, but not something bad. Now here's the thing for Beethoven. Between the 2 chords, there are 3 notes in common. Only the bass note is different. So, dominant, diminished, dominant, diminished, dominant, diminished, dominant. Remember, dominant going triumphantly to the home key, in this case, F minor. So Beethoven is going to do 2 things with this. 1, he's going to take that diminished harmony and he's going to shove it in our faces for extended periods, longer than anything I'm aware of that ever happened before Beethoven came along to write the Appassionata. The other thing he's going to do is to put it in direct conflict with the dominant 7th chord and hand over to the dominant 7th chord a kind of victory at the end of the 1st movement and at the end of the famous end, finale of the 3rd movement, as if to say, well, we've been living in this Gothic horror of the diminished 7th chord for all this time. It's now time to hand over victory to the virtuous and doughty dominant 7th chord. So let me just show you a couple of examples in the 1st movement. Some of them I've already played, but to show what wide and extensive use he makes of it. To begin with, in the very, very beginning, diminished 7th chord goes away. That's its function. Make it go away, it goes from here to there, and then it stops. Similarly here. Existence, because if you blow it, then you make a mess of the rest of the performance. That run consists of 3 notes. Playing it slowly, it's an E, a G, and a B flat, all the way down till 4 notes before the end of it. They are the 3 notes that the diminished and the dominant have in common. So we don't know what harmony he's using until the very, very end. Now, is it going to be a C? No, it's the D flat. Since you pedal it all the way through, you now know that this is that diminished harmony. And then it gives you that. So it's there to shove it in your face immediately. The most prominent passage, let me play for you now quickly and then move on to the 2nd and 3rd movements. This is as Beethoven makes his way from the development section into the recapitulation. And he gives us an extended passage that is all diminished 7th and then comes down and pits the 2 chords against each other in a very loud and prominent way. diminished dominant, and then he goes into the recapitulation. He uses it similarly toward the end of the coda. I don't have time to play the whole thing, but there's a series of arpeggiated runs, and I just want to show you how he sort of hands over victory to that dominant seventh. We've been playing. The second movement is an oasis in this sonata. If we talk about the contrast of feelings in romantic music as Hofmann defined it, here is a case where a romantic composer, if Beethoven is one, did write an entire movement of a piece that is just pretty much on one emotional level. It's a series of variations. So each variation sounds a little different from the previous one. But as to mood, it's pretty much a consistent mood. There is never a diminished seventh chord to be heard in this entire stretch of music. And here's what it sounds like until the end. how could somebody do something like that and thrust that in the face of the audience? He's going to bring it back in a way similar to what he did in the first movement, and then once again deliver the victory to the dominant and the traditional harmony. So let me just play through those and finish up. Here's a passage that comes close to the end before the finale. He's now playing in a less than subtle way the dominant seventh chord. And the question is, what's he going to do with it next? So we hear toward the end, that's all dominant tonic, dominant tonic. And what to do next? Beethoven calls in the gypsies at this point. There's a Hungarian dance called the Verbukosh, and it was used by Hungarian army officers to recruit young men into the army. So they would go into villages, they would gather the young guys into the village square. They brought along a band of gypsy musicians. The gypsy musicians would strike up a Verbukosh. And as you'll hear, the idea was to get the guys dancing. So they would dance their way right into the army and off to fight Napoleon. This is not music played by trained classical musicians, so the tempos are off. It's meant to be excited and excitable, accelerating. And typically, the violinist in the finale to a Verbukosh would be given an opportunity to show off his chops by playing some really, really fast 16th notes. So instead of ending, we bring in the gypsies and we hear something totally unrelated to anything that has happened in this sonata before. Cheesy key changes. Anybody who hits the notes right is a bad musician. Just trying to hedge my bets. If I miss every note, so a great pianist. If I get them all, he's got all the notes. So the violinist shows off his chops. So I hope if we accept the principles that Hofmann expressed in that review of the Fifth Symphony, if we accept grandeur, mystery, suspense, and contrast in feelings, powerful feelings, as as key qualities of what would get classified as romantic music, I think this would, and I think it would then make sense to describe Beethoven as a romantic composer.